The storm arrived without asking permission, loud and sudden, the kind that erased streets and swallowed sound, and by the time night settled in, the power was gone, block by block, until my house stood in a pocket of dim warmth surrounded by white. I sat alone in the living room with the lights off and the heater turned low, the fireplace casting a weak orange glow across the walls, enough to keep the cold away, but not enough to feel alive. Outside, the wind shoved snow sideways, rattling the windows like it wanted in, while the radio murmured warnings in a calm voice that somehow made everything worse. Wind chill at dangerous levels, roads closing, warming centers shutting early, emergency lines overwhelmed. I listened without reacting, staring into my coffee cup as if it held answers, telling myself I had done everything right by staying home, by staying quiet. Then my phone chimed. The doorbell camera. I did not move. I told myself it was nothing. Someone lost, someone who would knock once and leave because people always left eventually. The chime sounded again, sharper this time, and I glanced down at the screen to spite myself. A woman stood on my front step, snow clinging to her coat, her shoulders hunched forward as if bracing against more than just the cold. She held a child tight against her chest, one arm wrapped around his back, the other raised halfway as if unsure whether to knock again. Even through the grainy image, I could see the coat was too thin, the child too still. I stayed in my chair. The radio crackled with another update, the announcer reminding listeners that tonight was not safe to be outside, that exposure could turn deadly faster than people realized. I reached over and turned the volume down, not because I disagreed, but because I did not want to hear the part where responsibility started to sound personal. On the screen, the woman knocked the sound dull but unmistakable as it carried through the house. I did not answer. Instead, I stood, walked to the wall, and switched off the porch light. The front of my house vanished into darkness, the outline of the woman and child swallowed by the storm. It felt easier that way, like pretending not to exist might absolve me of what I was seeing. I told myself this was about safety. I told myself people did not open doors to strangers in the middle of the night anymore. I told myself I was not equipped for whatever problem had landed on my steps. Still, I watched. The woman shifted her weight, stamping her foot once, then again, trying to keep circulation going. She knocked a second time softer, like she already knew the answer. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against the door, her breath fogging the glass, then straightened. The child stirred. He lifted his head from her shoulder and looked around, blinking snow from his lashes. Then he looked up, not at the door, not at the storm, but directly into the small, dark eye of the camera above the frame. His face filled the screen, cheeks flushed, lips pale, eyes clear in a way that made my chest tighten. He spoke calmly, as if explaining something important, his voice carrying through the tiny speaker on my phone. Mom says knocking is what brave people do. The words hit harder than the wind. I did not turn the camera away. I did not drop the phone. I sat there and felt the heat from my own fireplace against my face, while outside someone else stood freezing because of a choice I was actively making. The child coughed a dry sound that bent his small body forward, and the woman rubbed his back instinctively, whispering words I could not hear but recognized anyway. I thought about standing up and opening the door, and I thought about staying exactly where I was. I thought about risk and responsibility, and how easy it was to justify silence when it wore the mask of caution. The radio murmured again in the background, a reminder that tonight was dangerous, that help was limited, that people needed to look out for themselves. I realized, sitting there in the half-light, that I was already doing the wrong thing, and knowing it did not make it easier. My legs felt heavy as I stood. I walked to the door slowly, as if giving myself time to change my mind, my hand hovering near the chain lock. Through the wood, I could hear the wind, the child's uneven breathing, the quiet patience of someone who had already asked and was waiting anyway. I slid the chain free, the soft metallic sound loud in the silence. I rested my palm on the handle and stopped, aware that whatever I did next would be something I would have to live with long after the storm passed. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place, the cold rushing in immediately like it had been waiting for permission, and for a second, no one said anything. The woman stepped back half a pace on instinct, tightening her hold on the boy, her eyes moving quickly from my face to the chain to the camera above the door, then back to me. She was alert, Not desperate in the way people imagine desperation to look, but controlled, guarded the way someone gets when they have learned not to trust easily. I told her she could stand under the porch light if she wanted, and flicked it back on the sudden glow, making all three of us blink. Up close, the boy looked younger than I had thought, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyelashes tipped with melting snow. He stared at me without fear, studying my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. I told them my name and said they could come just inside the entryway where it was warmer, that the door would stay unlocked and the camera on, that they could leave at any time. The woman hesitated, then nodded once, the kind of nod that said she was agreeing because she had weighed every other option and found them worse. She introduced herself as Lena and the boy as Caleb. As soon as they stepped inside, Caleb let out a small breath of relief, not dramatic, just a quiet sound like someone setting something heavy down. I noticed his hands immediately, how stiff his fingers were as he rubbed them together, and without thinking, I gestured toward the heater vent near the floor. He crouched in front of it, holding his palms out, sighing softly as warm air hit his skin. It was such a simple thing that it made my throat tighten. Lena stayed closer to the door, her coat still on her body, angled toward the exit, even as she thanked me. I told her there was no rush, that the storm was bad and would probably get worse before it got better, and she nodded again without committing to anything. Caleb looked up at me from his crouch and smiled a small, polite smile, like he was trying to put me at ease instead of the other way around. He asked if I was cold too. The question caught me off guard. I told him no, not really, and he frowned slightly as if considering that answer. He asked why I was shaking then, and I realized my hands were trembling just a little. Not from the cold, but from something else I did not have a name for yet. Lena shot him a look, murmuring his name in warning, but I shook my head and told her it was fine. He was just asking questions, and he nodded as if relieved I understood that. Caleb stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans, and looked around the entryway with quiet curiosity. He did not ask about the house, or the furniture, or why everything looked so clean and unused. Instead, he asked if I lived there by myself. I said yes before thinking about it too much, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not concern, just recognition. He said his mom lived with him too, just the two of them, and Lena gave a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I offered them some water and a blanket, emphasizing that it was no trouble that I kept extras around, and Lena accepted the blanket for Caleb, but declined the water, saying they had already had some. The way she said it told me she did not want to owe anything, not even a glass of water. Caleb wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and leaned back against the wall, his eyes half closing as the warmth settled in. He asked if the storm scared me. I told him I did not like storms much, which was true in a way I did not yet want to examine. He nodded thoughtfully and said storms scared him sometimes too, especially when they were loud and everything went dark. He said it felt like the world forgot you for a little while. The words landed heavier than he seemed to realize. Lena cleared her throat and said they should probably not stay too long, that they did not want to intrude. I told her she was not intruding, that they could stay until the storm eased, but even as I said it, I felt the limits of my own offer, the invisible line I had drawn to keep everything controlled. Caleb looked up at me again, his head tilted slightly. He asked if I went home for Christmas. The question was simple, almost casual, but it hit something sharp inside my chest. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. I realized then that he was not asking where I went, but whether there was a place I belonged to enough to call it home. Lena noticed the pause and stepped in gently, telling Caleb that was a personal question, that people did not always want to talk about holidays. Caleb looked at her, then back at me, and shrugged in a way that said he accepted the explanation without fully understanding it. He wrapped the blanket tighter around himself and yawned, the adrenaline of the cold finally giving way to exhaustion. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the door, and the radio announced another update I did not listen to. I stood there with them in my entryway, aware of how thin the walls between our lives suddenly felt, and realized that the boy had already spoken to a part of me I had spent a long time pretending was not there. The storm did not ease the way people hope storms will, with a pause or a softening, but grew louder as the night pressed on the wind, scraping along the siding and lifting snow into sharp little spirals that slapped the windows and fell away. Caleb slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, the blanket pooled around his legs, his back resting against the warm air vent like it was the safest place in the house. Lena watched him closely every few seconds, counting his breaths without meaning to. Her body still angled toward the door as if she expected to need it at any moment. I stayed where I was, hands loose at my sides, listening to the radio speak in even tones about closures and outages and the strain on emergency services. When the announcer said there were no more warming centers within several miles, Lena inhaled sharply and reached for her phone. She stepped a few feet away and tried to dial, then tried again, her thumb moving faster each time, as if effort alone could bring back a signal. She shook her head at the screen frustration flashing across her face before she smoothed it away and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She told me quietly that the bus routes had been suspended and that the last shelter she knew of had closed earlier than planned. She said it without accusation, just a statement of fact, and then added that they would figure something out. Caleb looked up at her, eyes heavy but alert, and asked if they were going to sleep in the car again. Lena knelt beside him immediately, brushing snow from his hair and telling him not tonight, that they would be somewhere warm, that everything was fine. The way she said it made it clear she was convincing herself as much as him. I felt the urge to speak rise and stall in my throat. I could offer the guest room. I could say they could stay until morning. The words lined up in my mind and refused to move. Instead, I nodded and said the storm might pass by dawn, which was true and useless at the same time. Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the wind and the soft hiss of heat. Caleb tugged the blanket closer and leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes drifting closed. He opened them again a moment later and looked at me with the same steady curiosity he had shown from the porch. He asked if I had a flashlight. I handed him one from the drawer near the door, and he clicked it on and off a few times, watching the beam cut through the dim space. He said he liked how light made things feel closer, like you could see where you were supposed to go. Lena smiled faintly at that, and then thanked me again, the words careful and contained. She told me they did not want to be any trouble, and that they would leave as soon as it felt safe enough. I told her there was no rush and meant it in the narrow sense that it was true, but I did not widen the offer beyond that. The radio updated again, a reminder that exposure could become dangerous in minutes if the wind shifted. I turned it down, then off, as if muting the warning would make it less real. Caleb flicked the flashlight beam across the ceiling and laughed softly when it caught the dust motes drifting in the air. He asked if the house was old. I told him it was not, that it had been renovated recently, and he nodded, like that answered a bigger question. He said old places sometimes creaked when storms came, like they were talking to themselves. I watched him talk and wondered how someone so small could be so present, how he seemed to notice everything without carrying the weight of it. Lena wrapped her arms around herself and rubbed her hands together, her eyes on Caleb, but her thoughts somewhere else. She asked me very calmly if there was anywhere nearby they could go if the storm got worse. The way she phrased it made it easy to dodge, and I took the opening, telling her about a hotel a few miles away, about a community center that sometimes opened during emergencies, about resources I knew existed in theory but had not checked in practice. She listened, nodding, and then said quietly that the roads were already bad and that she did not have a car anymore. The words landed and stayed. Caleb clicked the flashlight off and set it beside him. He leaned his head against the wall again, eyes closing, then opening, then closing, the rhythm uneven. He started to shiver just slightly, the kind of shiver you might miss if you were not watching closely. Lena noticed immediately and pulled the blanket tighter around him, pressing her palm against his back. She looked up at me, then not pleading, not demanding, just honest in a way that felt heavier than either. She said if he got worse, she did not know where they would go. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished and complete, all at once. I stood there and felt the space between what I could do and what I was willing to do stretch thin. I thought about the locked rooms in my house, the unused bed, the extra heat I could afford to waste. I thought about boundaries and risk and the comfort of rules that kept everything clean and distant. I thought about how easy it was to let silence answer questions I did not want to face. Caleb stirred and murmured something about the storm, his voice barely audible. Lena whispered back her tone, steady and low, telling him she was there, that he was safe. I realized then that my silence was also an answer, that by not speaking, I was choosing a path as surely as if I had slammed the door. The wind howled again, louder this time, and the lights flickered once before steadying. I took a breath and felt it catch, aware that whatever came next would require more than quiet reassurance. I took a slow breath and said the words carefully, choosing each one like it mattered because it did. I told Lena I was not offering a bedroom and I was not asking them to stay the night, not yet, not like that. I said they could use the front living room where the heat vent ran strongest, that the door would stay unlocked, the camera would stay on, and the lights would stay up so nothing felt hidden. I said I would sit at the table nearby and keep my phone on the counter in plain sight. I said if at any point she wanted to leave, she could no questions asked. The way I spoke surprised me. It was steadier than I felt. Lena listened without interrupting, her eyes moving over the room, noting the distance to the door, the wide window, the open line of sight. She did not answer right away. She knelt beside Caleb and pulled his hood up a little higher around his ears, rubbing warmth back into his hands. He looked at her and then at me, quiet for once, as if he understood something important was being decided. Lena asked one question, simple and direct, about whether anyone else had access to the house. I told her no, that I lived alone, that the neighbors were close enough to see the lights, that I had already called the local non-emergency line to let them know I had people sheltering from the storm. I said it plainly, not as a reassurance trick, just as a fact. She nodded once, then again, like she was testing the weight of the decision. Finally, she said, "Okay, just for now," and the word carried more trust than I had expected to earn. Caleb smiled faintly and pushed himself up from the floor blanket trailing behind him like a cape. He walked over to the fireplace and held his palms out, careful not to get too close, his shoulders relaxing inch by inch as the warmth reached him. He pressed his hands together and then held them to his cheeks, closing his eyes. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a shift in the room. Lena stayed near the edge of the couch, sitting upright with her coat still on her feet, planted flat on the floor as if ready to move at any second. I pulled a chair from the dining table and sat where she could see me clearly, far enough away to give space close enough to show I was present. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the house, the sound softened the walls, holding back the worst of it. Caleb opened his eyes and looked around, taking in the room with quiet curiosity. He did not comment on the furniture or the pictures or the lack of them. He walked to the window instead and traced a finger along the glass, watching snow swirl under the streetlight. He said it looked like the world was shaking a snow globe. Lena smiled at that, a real smile this time, brief but unguarded. She told him to come sit down before he slipped. He obeyed, without argument, curling up on the rug near the vent, the blanket tucked around his shoulders. He placed his hands on the floor, feeling the warmth travel up his arms, and sighed. He said it was warm but lonely, and the word hung there, not accusing, just observant. I felt it land somewhere deep in my chest. I told him houses could feel that way sometimes when they were quiet for too long. He nodded like that made sense. Lena watched the exchange closely, not suspicious now, but thoughtful, as if she was cataloging the way I responded, measuring consistency more than kindness. I offered her tea, and she accepted after a pause, nodding toward the kettle with a tired smile. I poured the water and set the mug on the table within her reach, then stepped back to my chair. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the steam rise toward her face, her shoulders dropping a fraction as the heat seeped in. We sat like that for a few minutes, listening to the wind and the soft pop of the fire, no one rushing to fill the quiet. The radio stayed off. Caleb shifted closer to the vent and pressed his palm flat against the floor again, then looked up at me with a serious expression. He asked if the house always stayed warm. I told him it did, that it had been built for winters like this. He nodded and said that was good because cold made everything feel smaller. Lena reached out and brushed his hair back her fingers, lingering for a second like she was grounding herself. She thanked me again, her voice low and sincere, and I told her she did not need to keep thanking me. I realized as I said it that I meant it, that the exchange did not feel like a favor anymore, but a shared moment of shelter. The lights flickered once and steadied the heater humming softly, doing its job without fuss. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy, but inside the room, something had eased. Not solved, not fixed, just eased enough to breathe. I looked at Lena and saw that she was watching Caleb now, not the door, and I understood that this was the only offer she could accept, one built on visibility and choice, on staying without being trapped. The thought settled into me with a quiet weight, and I wondered how many times I had missed chances like this by offering too much or too little, by not understanding what safety actually meant. The idea came to me the way easy ideas often do, quick and clean and wrong, and before I could stop myself, I was already reaching for my wallet. It felt logical in the shallow way logic sometimes works when it tries to bypass discomfort. Money was something I understood. Money was something I could offer without opening anything else. I told Lena there was a motel a few miles away that I could cover a room for the night, that it would be warmer and quieter and safer than sitting through the storm. I said it casually, like it was no more complicated than suggesting tea, and held the bills out in my hand to make the offer tangible. The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Lena looked at the money and then at me, her expression not angry, not offended, just firm in a way that made my chest tighten. She shook her head once slow and deliberate and pushed my hand back toward me without touching it. She said thank you but no, and the thank you mattered as much as the refusal. She told me she did not want her son to think help always came wrapped in cash or that being uncomfortable meant someone else had to pay to make it go away. She said it calmly, not as a lesson, not as a rebuke, just a boundary she had learned to hold on to. I felt heat rush to my face, embarrassment mixing with something heavier. I told her I had not meant it that way, that I just wanted to make sure they were okay, and she nodded, saying she understood that it was kind of me to think of it, but that they were okay where they were for now. Caleb had been quiet through the exchange, watching us with a seriousness that felt older than his years. He shifted on the rug and tugged the blanket tighter around his shoulders, then looked up at me with a small frown. He asked if money made people stop being lonely. The question landed between us simple and devastating in equal measure. I opened my mouth and then closed it again, realizing I did not have an answer that would make sense to him or to me. Lena glanced at him surprised and then smiled faintly, telling him that was a big question for a night like this. Caleb shrugged like he accepted that and reached for the flashlight again, clicking it on and off until the beam caught the corner of the room where a small side table sat empty. He asked if I had any paper and a pen. I told him I did and brought a notepad from the drawer along with a pencil I had not used in years. He took them carefully, settling cross-legged on the rug, the blanket slipping down around his waist as he focused. He did not ask what he should draw. He did not announce his plan. He just bent over the paper and began to move the pencil his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Lena watched him with a softness that replaced the tension from earlier, her shoulders relaxing as she sipped her tea. I sat back in my chair and tried to understand the quiet shame curling in my stomach. Offering money had felt safe because it asked nothing of me beyond a transaction. Being present felt riskier, like it required something I had spent a long time guarding. The wind slammed against the house again, and the heater kicked on, filling the room with a steady hum. Caleb paused, held the paper up to check his work, then returned to it with renewed focus. After a few minutes, he scooted closer to the table and held the page out toward me, not proudly, not shyly, just offering it the way children do when they want to share something that matters. I leaned forward and took it. The drawing was simple uneven lines and bold shapes, but it was clear enough. 3 figures stood under a roof with a bright square that I recognized as a door. One figure was tall, one was smaller, one was in between. Above them, snow fell in looping lines, and over the door, a small circle glowed meant to be the porch light. I felt my throat tighten as I looked at it. Lena leaned over to see and let out a quiet breath, her hand moving instinctively to Caleb's shoulder. He told us it was Santa stopping by a house that was warm. He said the people inside were not forgotten because the light was on. I nodded and thanked him, meaning it more than I could explain. He smiled and took the paper back, folding it carefully and tucking it under the notepad like it was something fragile. The room settled again, the earlier edge replaced by a gentler quiet. Lena set her mug down and looked at me, her expression thoughtful. She told me she appreciated the offer truly and that she knew I meant well. She said money solved some problems, but it did not solve the one she worried about most, which was what her son learned about the world when things went wrong. I listened and nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in. I told her I was sorry if I had overstepped, and she waved it off, saying it was okay that people offered what they knew how to offer. Caleb yawned, the effort wide and unguarded, and leaned back against the couch, his head tipping to the side. Lena adjusted the blanket around him, her movements practiced and gentle. I realized then that the mistake had not been offering money, but thinking it was the most important thing I had to give. The storm continued outside, relentless, but inside the room the air felt different, less transactional, more human. I folded my hands together and sat with them, unsure of what would come next, but certain that whatever it was, it would not fit neatly into my wallet. I realized a few minutes later that the living room was doing its job, but only barely, the heat uneven, and the air still carrying that hollow feeling of a place meant to be passed through, not stayed in. I told Lena there was another room just off the hallway they could use if they wanted closer to a vent that actually worked the way it was supposed to. I made sure to say if they wanted, not because I was unsure, but because choice had become the only currency that mattered. Lena considered it, her eyes moving again to the door, then to Caleb, who was slumped sideways against the couch, the flashlight resting loose in his hand. She asked where the room was and how close it was to the front of the house. I showed her the hallway turned on, the lights, opened the door wide so there was nothing hidden. The room had been cleaned recently, not because I planned to use it, but because unused spaces tend to collect a certain kind of guilt. It was meant to be a sitting room, once a spare place with a couch that no one ever sat on and a small table that held nothing. I had never bothered to adjust the heat in there. It stayed cold by default, like a reminder I did not need. When I stepped inside ahead of them and turned the vent open, warm air rushed out with a hiss, startling Caleb enough to make him laugh softly. He followed the sound and pressed his hands toward it again, repeating the small ritual like it mattered. Lena stood in the doorway, watching the room fill with light, watching me stand back to give space. She nodded once and guided Caleb in, settling him onto the couch and pulling the blanket up to his chest. The room looked different immediately, not because anything had changed, but because someone was using it for what it was meant for. I sat on the edge of a chair near the door, not entering, fully aware of how easily comfort can tip into intrusion if you are not paying attention. Caleb stretched out his legs and sighed, his body finally giving in to the warmth. He asked what the room was for. I told him it used to be for guests, people who visited and then left. He thought about that and said maybe tonight it was for storms. I smiled before I could stop myself. Lena relaxed just enough to lean back against the arm of the couch, her eyes closing for a brief moment like she was borrowing rest instead of claiming it. I noticed then how quiet the house had become. The storm muted by distance and insulation, the heater's hum steady and reassuring. Caleb rolled onto his side and reached down his fingers, brushing against the edge of the couch where something solid met his hand. He knelt down and looked underneath, curiosity waking him again. He pulled out a low cardboard box, dust puffing into the air as it scraped along the floor. Lena straightened immediately, asking him to be careful, apologizing to me, but I waved it off and told her it was fine. The box had been there longer than I cared to admit. Caleb lifted the lid with both hands, peering inside with the kind of reverence children reserve for things that might be treasures. Inside were tangled strings of lights, a few cracked ornaments wrapped in tissue, and an old red stocking folded flat at the bottom. Dust clung to everything, softening the colors and dulling the shine. Caleb reached for the stocking and unfolded it slowly. A name was stitched across the top. The letters faded and partially unraveled as if time itself had tried to erase them. Lena froze where she sat, her eyes flicking to my face and then back to the stocking, understanding without needing an explanation. Caleb traced the letters with his finger, sounding them out quietly. He looked up at me, his expression gentle, not curious in the invasive way adults sometimes are, but open in a way that made my chest ache. I felt the room tighten around us. I told him that the room stayed cold because no one used it anymore. It was not the whole truth, but it was close enough to matter. He nodded, still holding the stocking, and said, "Maybe rooms got cold when they missed people." Lena inhaled sharply and then let it out her hand, finding Caleb's shoulder. She told him to put it back carefully, that some things were important, even if they were old. He did as she asked, folding the stocking the same way he had found it and placing it back in the box, smoothing the tissue over it like he was tucking it in. I closed the lid and slid the box back under the couch, the dust settling again, quieter this time. The heat continued to build in the room, chasing away the chill inch by inch. Caleb curled up on the couch, his breathing evening out, the flashlight forgotten on the table. Lena adjusted the blanket and brushed his hair back, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was anchoring herself in the moment. She looked at me and said thank you, not for the room, but for not taking it away once it had been found. I nodded, unsure how to respond without saying too much. I realized then that this room had never been meant to stay cold forever, that I had just stopped giving it permission to be anything else. The storm outside roared on, but inside, that once unused space warmth held quiet and unremarkable and necessary. The room settled into a quiet that felt heavier than silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing, and for a few minutes, none of us spoke. The heater hummed steadily, doing its work without asking for attention, and outside, the storm continued its long argument with the night. Caleb lay curled on the couch, the blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes half closed but not yet asleep. He stared at the ceiling as if following shapes only he could see, his fingers absently rubbing the edge of the fabric. Lena sat near him, her back straight but no longer rigid, her watchfulness softened by fatigue and the fragile sense of safety she had allowed herself to borrow. I stood near the doorway, unsure whether to sit or remain where I was aware that every movement carried weight now. Caleb's gaze drifted back to the spot under the couch where the box had been hidden away again. He frowned slightly as if something unfinished tugged at him, and then he turned his head toward me. He asked very quietly whose name was on the stocking. The question did not feel intrusive. It felt careful, like he was testing the ground before stepping forward. Lena's eyes lifted to mine immediately, concern flickering there, but she did not interrupt. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to deflect, to change the subject, to offer something vague and harmless. The name rose in my throat and caught there, heavy and unwelcome a sound I had trained myself not to make. I could have told him it belonged to someone who did not live there anymore, which would have been true enough. I could have said it was from a long time ago and left it at that. Instead, I swallowed and said the name. Evan. The word felt strange in the air, like it had been waiting for permission to exist again. Lena inhaled sharply, not in surprise but in recognition, and her hand tightened on the arm of the couch. Caleb repeated the name once, softly tasting it, then nodded. He did not ask who Evan was. He did not ask what had happened. He only said it sounded like a strong name. I found myself nodding in agreement, my throat tight. I told him Evan had been my son. The sentence came out flat, factual, stripped of everything else. I did not explain. I did not offer a timeline or a reason or an apology to the universe. I said it and let it stand on its own. Caleb's expression did not change in the way adults expect when children hear heavy truths. He did not look afraid or confused. He simply absorbed it as if adding another piece to a picture he was quietly assembling. He asked if Evan liked storms. The simplicity of the question knocked the air from my lungs. For a moment, all I could see was a small boy pressed against a window years ago, watching rain streak down the glass, asking if thunder was angry or just loud. I closed my eyes briefly and shook my head. I told Caleb that Evan did not like storms very much, that he liked things to be calm and bright and predictable. Caleb considered that, then said storms were loud, but they passed, and sometimes afterward everything felt cleaner. Lena watched the exchange in silence, her face open and unguarded in a way it had not been earlier, as if something about the honesty had shifted the ground beneath us all. I felt exposed, not because I had shared too much, but because I had shared exactly enough. The name lingered in the room, no longer trapped in the box under the couch or the locked spaces of my memory. Caleb yawned again, longer this time, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. Lena pulled the blanket higher and brushed his hair back from his forehead, her movements gentle and precise. She whispered something to him that made him smile faintly before his eyes slid shut. His breathing evened out slow and steady, and I realized with a start how deeply quiet the house had become. I took a step back, intending to give them space, but Lena looked up and met my eyes. She did not say anything at first. Then she thanked me, not with words of gratitude that felt rehearsed or polite, but with a simple acknowledgement of what it cost to speak a name you had buried. She told me she was sorry, and the way she said it did not demand a response. I nodded, unsure how to answer without closing something I had just opened. We sat like that for a while, the three of us sharing the same quiet, the same warmth, the same fragile understanding that grief does not disappear when it is spoken, but it changes shape. I thought about how long I had avoided saying Evan's name, how many times I had chosen silence because it felt safer, cleaner, less likely to unravel me. Saying it now had not fixed anything. It had not eased the ache or rewritten the past, but it had made the room warmer in a way the heater never could. Outside, the wind howled and the snow piled higher, but inside that once forgotten space, something had shifted. The room no longer felt cold or unused. It felt inhabited by memory and presence, by people willing to sit with what was hard without trying to solve it. I stood quietly listening to Caleb's breathing and the steady hum of heat, and understood that the name I never said out loud had finally found a place to rest, not locked away, but held. The house grew quieter after Evan's name settled into the room, not an empty quiet, but a listening one, as if the walls themselves had leaned in. Caleb slept on his side with one arm tucked under his cheek, the blanket rising and falling with his breath. Lena sat beside him, her shoulders finally lowering from the guarded line she had carried all night. I moved to the kitchen to make tea and returned without comment, setting the mug within her reach and taking my seat near the doorway where I could see them both without hovering. Outside, the storm kept its rhythm, wind pressing and releasing snow scratching along the siding. Inside, the heater hummed and the fire popped once, a small sound that felt loud in the stillness. It was then that Caleb stirred. He did not wake fully. He shifted, rubbed his eyes, and murmured something soft and unintelligible. Lena leaned closer, whispering reassurance. He opened his eyes halfway and looked toward me, then toward the ceiling, as if orienting himself to where he was. He smiled faintly and said he could not sleep because it was too quiet. I told him he could hum if he wanted. It came out before I could think about it, an instinctive offering meant to soothe the child back to rest. He nodded and began to hum a tune, uneven at first, then finding its way. He did not sing words, just the melody, a simple carol that drifted through the room like breath on glass. The tune found me before I could stop it. My chest tightened and my hands curled together in my lap. It was the same melody I had sung years ago in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and plastic, my voice low and careful so it would not disturb the machines. I had sung it badly then too, missing notes, starting and stopping, trying to sound steady for a boy who was tired and scared. The memory rose sharp and uninvited. I felt my control slip the way it does when you think you are prepared and realize you are not. Caleb hummed on, unaware of the ground shifting beneath me. Lena noticed immediately. She did not look at me directly. She did not reach out. She stayed still and gave me space, her presence quiet and steady like a guardrail. The hum faltered as Caleb yawned again, then picked up once more, softer now. I tried to breathe through it, counting the seconds between each rise of his chest, telling myself I was here, that this was now not then. My eyes burned anyway. I stared at the far wall until the lines blurred, and then the tears came. Not a dramatic release, just a steady spill I could not stop. I did not wipe them away. I did not turn my face. I let them fall because the effort to hold them back felt heavier than the grief itself. The sound of my breathing changed, and I heard it echo in the quiet. Caleb's humming slowed and stopped. He looked at me with concern that was gentle rather than alarmed. He asked if the song made me sad. I nodded once and tried to smile. He thought about that and said, "Songs did that sometimes, especially the ones you sang when you wanted things to be okay." The simplicity of the truth undid me more than the memory had. Lena shifted then, not to comfort me but to adjust the blanket around Caleb and whisper that it was time to rest. He nodded and closed his eyes again, the tune fading into the quiet as his breathing evened out. The room held us in that moment, the heater humming the fire low, the storm distant but present. I pressed my palms together and felt the tremor ease slowly, my body finding its way back to something like calm. Lena spoke softly without turning toward me, telling me it was okay, that I did not have to explain anything. I nodded, grateful for the permission. After a minute, when my breathing steadied, I found my voice again. I told her there was something I had never told anyone, not because it was secret, but because it felt unfinished. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. I had not planned to say them. Lena did not respond right away. She waited, giving the silence shape instead of filling it. I looked at Caleb, asleep and warm, and then back at the space between us. I realized that control had been my shield for a long time, a way to keep grief contained and manageable. The song had slipped past it easily, not by force, but by familiarity. I felt exposed and strangely lighter at the same time. The storm outside eased just a fraction, the wind losing its sharpest edge, and for the first time that night, the house did not feel like a place I was defending. It felt like a place holding something fragile without breaking it. I sat there letting the quiet settle again, knowing that once control breaks, you do not get to decide what comes next, only whether you stay present for it. I waited until I was sure Caleb was asleep before I spoke again, not because I wanted to protect him from the truth, but because I wanted to hear my own voice say it without interruption. The room was dim and warm now, the heater steady, the storm outside quieter, but still present like a reminder that danger does not always announce when it is leaving. Lena sat across from me, her hands folded around her mug, her posture open but cautious, ready to listen without pressing. I told her the truth the way it came to me, not polished, not arranged to earn sympathy, just laid out in the order it happened, because that was the only way I knew how to say it. I told her Evan got sick fast, faster than anyone expected, and that I was not there when it mattered, because I thought there would be time later. I told her I chose meetings and deadlines and calls. I told myself could not wait, and how each choice felt small until they added up to something irreversible. I did not blame the doctors or the weather or fate. I did not tell the story like an accident that happened to me. I told it like a decision I made and lived with. Lena listened without interrupting her face, steady, her eyes kind, but not indulgent. I said I arrived at the hospital after it was already over and stood in a room full of machines that had nothing left to do, and how afterward I learned to live in a way that avoided being needed by anyone ever again. I said I built walls that looked like order and success and control, and how people assumed that meant I was fine. I admitted that I let them believe it because correcting them felt like more work than I could manage. My voice shook once and then steadied. I did not cry this time. I felt strangely calm, like the truth had been waiting for a night loud enough to carry it away. Lena nodded slowly, absorbing what I said without rushing to fix it. She told me she understood more than I might think, that loss rearranges your sense of time and priority in ways no one prepares you for. She did not compare our losses or weigh them. She simply said she had learned that people tell themselves stories to survive, and sometimes those stories need to be retired. I laughed quietly at that, surprised by the sound. I said I had been telling myself I was being responsible when really I was being afraid. The room held that admission without judgment. Caleb shifted in his sleep and murmured something soft, his brow creasing briefly before smoothing again. I watched him and felt the ache in my chest turn into something else. Not relief, not forgiveness, but clarity. I realized I had been lying most to myself, pretending that distance was the same as safety, and that silence was the same as strength. Lena stood and checked on Caleb, adjusting the blanket and brushing his hair back, her movements gentle and practiced. She returned to her seat and looked at me with a seriousness that felt earned. She asked what I planned to do with the truth now that I had said it. The question startled me. I told her I did not know that stopping the lie felt like the first step, but not the last. She nodded and said that was usually how it went. Caleb woke then just a little, his eyes opening to slits as he searched the room. He looked at me and smiled sleepily, then reached for the folded drawing he had tucked beside him earlier. He unfolded it and held it out to me without ceremony. The picture looked the same as before, 3 figures under a roof with a bright square for a door, but seeing it now felt different, heavier, and lighter at once. He told me Santa did not forget people who kept their lights on even when they were tired. He said sometimes Santa sent people to remind you. I felt something inside me loosen a knot I had carried so long I thought it was part of me. I thanked him and told him the picture meant a lot. He nodded like that was enough and drifted back to sleep, the drawing resting on his chest. The storm outside quieted further, the wind easing into a steady hush. I sat there with the truth between us, not demanding absolution, not expecting anything in return, just present in a way I had avoided for years. I understood then that stopping the lie did not make me a better person, but it made me an honest one, and that was a place I could finally stand without bracing for impact. Morning arrived without ceremony, the storm loosening its grip sometime before dawn and leaving behind a pale quiet that felt tentative rather than triumphant. The house held the night in its corners, warmth lingering in the air, the heater cycling on and off like a steady breath. I woke first, not because of noise, but because my body had learned to surface early after long nights of vigilance. Light filtered through the window, turning the snow outside into a smooth field of white. Caleb slept curled on the couch, the blanket tucked around him, the drawing folded carefully at his side. Lena dozed in the chair nearby, her head tipped back, hands resting open in her lap. I moved slowly, mindful of every sound, and set water onto heat. The kettle clicked and then hummed. When Lena stirred, she blinked a few times and met my eyes without surprise, as if she had been expecting the morning to find us this way. We shared a quiet nod. I poured tea and offered her a mug. She accepted, cradling it with both hands, her shoulders easing as the warmth seeped in. Caleb woke a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and stretching his face softer now that the worst of the cold had passed. He asked if the storm was over. I told him it was mostly done, that the snow would take longer to leave than the wind. He nodded and slid off the couch, padding toward the window to look out. He pressed his nose to the glass and laughed softly at the way his breath fogged it. The morning felt ordinary in the best possible way. We ate simply toast and fruit, nothing special. Nothing that tried to pretend the night had been anything other than what it was. I did not offer money again. I did not promise solutions. I asked Lena what she needed next. The question felt different in my mouth, less like an obligation and more like an invitation. She thought for a moment and said she needed a plan that did not depend on luck. She said she needed information, not rescue. I nodded and told her I could help with that. I explained I had contacts with a local foundation that coordinated short-term housing resources and job placement support, that I could make introductions but not guarantees. I said I would send the information and let her decide what to do with it. She listened carefully and then said, "Thank you." Not brightly, not with relief, but with the measured gratitude of someone who knew the difference between help and charity. Caleb wandered back over and sat on the floor near us, listening with one ear while drawing shapes on the fogged window with his finger. He asked if I would still be here after Christmas. The question landed softly and stayed. I looked at Lena before answering, giving her the chance to redirect it if she wanted. She did not. I told Caleb yes, that I lived here and did not plan on going anywhere. He nodded as if that was the right answer and returned to his drawing. Lena finished her tea and set the mug down. She said they should get going before the roads turned slushy and unpredictable. She stood and gathered their things, efficient and calm. I walked them to the door and turned the porch light back on, the bright square of it falling onto the snow like a promise kept. At the threshold, Lena paused. She did not apologize for coming. She did not promise to stay in touch. She thanked me for staying present and said that mattered more than anything else I had offered. I nodded, unsure how to respond without diminishing it. Caleb handed me the drawing again, insisting I keep it. He said it belonged with the light. I took it and thanked him. He grinned and tugged on his hat, then stepped outside, his boots crunching into the snow. I watched them walk down the path, Lena's arm around his shoulders, their figures growing smaller against the white. The house felt quiet again after the door closed, but not empty. I stood there for a long moment, holding the drawing, feeling the morning settle into its shape. Forgiveness came later than people expect and quieter than they imagine. It did not arrive as a declaration or a moment of absolution. It came as the absence of condemnation, as the simple fact that no one asked me to prove I deserved to be there. I realized then that I had not been forgiven by someone else so much as allowed to forgive myself without conditions. I placed the drawing on the table where I could see it and began to clean up, moving through the house with a steadiness I had not felt in years. Outside, the day went on ordinary and cold and bright, and inside, I felt something repair itself, not all at once, but enough to keep going. The days that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point, and that was how I knew something real had begun. There were no sudden transformations, no headlines, no moment where everything lined up neatly and stayed that way. The morning after the storm looked like every other winter morning I had lived through in that house. Pale light, quiet streets, snow piled unevenly along the curb, the hum of normal life restarting in small, reluctant steps. I returned to my routines, answering emails, taking calls, walking through rooms that felt the same but no longer empty. I sent Lena the information I had promised, a short message with phone numbers, names, and times written plainly without encouragement or pressure. She replied later with a simple thank you and nothing else. I respected that. We did not speak every day. I did not check in under the excuse of concern. Instead, I made a point of staying available in ways that did not intrude. Some mornings I saw them on the sidewalk when I left for work. Caleb bundled up and hopping from patch to patch of snow like it was a game. Lena walking beside him, her posture steady, her eyes forward. We exchanged nods, sometimes a wave. That was all. And yet it mattered. The house settled into a new rhythm, one that included the knowledge of other lives moving nearby. I found myself keeping the porch light on longer at night, not as a signal, but as a habit. One afternoon, a few days before Christmas, there was a knock on the door. I checked the camera out of instinct and saw Lena standing there alone, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. I opened the door without hesitation this time, though I kept the chain on until we had both acknowledged it. She smiled faintly and said she was nearby for an appointment and wanted to return something she had borrowed, a blanket folded neatly over her arm. I invited her in the way you invite someone into a space you no longer need to defend. We stood in the entryway and talked briefly about practical things, the weather, the roads, the bus routes reopening. She told me she had an interview scheduled after the holiday and that she was hopeful without being certain. I told her that sounded right. Before she left, she asked if Caleb could stop by sometime to say hello. I said yes and meant it without calculating the cost. When Caleb came over later that week, it was daylight and calm, the house filled with ordinary sounds. He explored the rooms again with a familiarity that surprised me, pointing out things he remembered, asking questions that were curious but not prying. He asked if the room was still warm. I told him it was. He smiled at that and nodded like it was an important update. We did not talk about Evan. We did not talk about the storm. We built something small together at the table paper folded into shapes that barely held. Lena watched from the doorway, her presence relaxed her trust, earned inch by inch. When they left, the house returned to quiet, but it was a quiet that felt inhabited by possibility rather than absence. Christmas morning came without spectacle. I woke early and made coffee standing by the window as the light crept in. There were no gifts piled under a tree, no plans beyond the day itself. And still, the morning did not feel empty. Later, I received a message from Lena, a photo of Caleb holding up a small drawing he had made a door with light spilling out. No caption, just the image. I placed my phone down and let the moment sit. This was what healing looked like. Not miracles, not reversals, but continuity. Showing up again and again without expecting applause. Learning that presence does not need to be loud to be meaningful. I understood then why the morning mattered more than the night, why staying was harder than opening the door. The storm had given us an excuse. The days after demanded intention. I kept my routines. I kept my boundaries. And I kept the door open not physically, but in the way that counted. I did not know what the future would hold for any of us. I only knew that when the next winter came, I would not pretend not to be home. A year passed without anyone announcing it as a milestone which felt right. Time did what time does when you stop trying to wrestle it into meaning and instead let it move forward at its own pace. Winter returned gradually first as a suggestion in the air, then as frost along the edges of mornings, and finally as snow that softened the city into something quieter and more forgiving. The house changed with the seasons in small ways. I fixed the vent in the back room so the heat reached it evenly. I replaced a lamp that had always flickered. I kept the porch light on through the longest nights, not as a signal of rescue, but as a habit of welcome I no longer questioned. Lena and Caleb became part of my weeks in a way that never felt imposed. We shared space without claiming it, meals without ceremony, conversations without deadlines. Caleb grew taller and louder and more certain of himself, his curiosity expanding into questions about how things worked and why people made the choices they did. Lena found steadier ground, a job that paid fairly and respected her time, an apartment that was not perfect but was hers. We did not rush toward definitions. We let patterns form first. On the anniversary of the storm, the community center hosted a winter gathering, a simple thing with soup and folding chairs and paper snowflakes taped to the walls. I volunteered because it felt natural, not performative. Caleb helped children write notes to Santa at a long table near the windows, reading their words aloud with exaggerated seriousness. Lena stood nearby, laughing softly, correcting spelling when asked, stepping back when not. I watched them and felt the quiet satisfaction of continuity. When it was my turn to speak, I did not tell the whole story. I did not need to. I said that sometimes the bravest thing a person does is answer the door when it would be easier to stay quiet, and that presence sustained and ordinary can be a kind of repair no money ever manages. People nodded. Some smiled. Some looked away and breathed in like the words had found a place to rest. Later that night, back at the house, we stood in the entryway as snow began to fall again, thinner this time, gentle. Caleb pointed out how the flakes caught the porch light and said it looked like the air was breathing. Lena wrapped her coat tighter and thanked me for the evening for the steadiness of it. I told her she was always welcome, and the words did not feel like an offer anymore. They felt like a fact. After they left, I stood at the door for a moment longer than necessary, the light spilling out onto the steps, the warmth behind me steady and real. I thought about the man I had been sitting in the dark with the porch light off, convincing himself that safety meant silence. I thought about how little had changed on the outside and how much had shifted within reach. Keeping the door open did not mean abandoning boundaries or inviting chaos. It meant deciding again and again to stay present, to answer honestly, to allow warmth where cold had been default. It meant understanding that families are not always formed by birth or permanence, but by choice and return. I closed the door gently, not to shut anything out, but to hold what was inside. The house hummed the heat even, and reliable, the rooms no longer waiting to be used. I placed the old drawing on the wall near the entryway, not as a symbol, but as a reminder of what happens when you stop hiding. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work, and inside, the light stayed on. I want to say something before you leave this story, not as a narrator, not as a character, but as a person who once believed that staying silent was safer than opening a door. When that night ended, nothing miraculous happened right away. No music swelled. No promises fixed everything. What changed was smaller and heavier. A door stayed open, and sometimes that is the hardest thing to do. If you are still here listening, maybe it is because some part of this story brushed against your own life in a quiet way. Maybe you remember a night when someone knocked and you did not answer, or a moment when you needed help but convinced yourself not to ask. Many of us were raised to believe that strength means handling everything alone, that opening the door invites risk, disappointment, or loss. But what no one tells us is that closing it also costs something. It costs time. It costs connection. It costs the chance to be seen. As we get older, we carry more doors inside us than we realize. Doors we closed after a divorce, after a child moved out, after a friend stopped calling, after a loss we never learned how to speak about. We tell ourselves it is too late or that things are fine the way they are, even when they feel hollow. This story is not about being a hero. It is about choosing not to disappear. It is about staying when leaving would be easier, about presence when money or answers would feel more comfortable. If this story stirred something in you, it is not asking you to change your life overnight. It is only asking you to notice. Notice the quiet places where warmth is still possible. Notice the people who show up imperfectly but honestly. Notice that even now, even after everything, you are still capable of opening something that has been shut for a long time. Some people watching this have children they love deeply but do not know how to reach anymore. Some have parents they never fully understood. Some are alone in houses that are too quiet. None of that makes you broken. It makes you human. And humans heal slowly in moments that rarely look dramatic from the outside. If this story made you pause, then maybe pausing is exactly what you needed tonight. This channel exists for moments like that. Not to promise miracles, but to sit with you in the in-between where life actually happens, where regret and hope share the same room, where love does not arrive loudly but stays. If you choose to stay here to listen to more stories like this, know that you are not doing it for entertainment alone. You are giving yourself permission to feel, to remember, and maybe to soften where you have been holding yourself together for too long. And if there is someone in your life this story reminded you of someone you have not spoken to, someone you miss, or someone you once turned away from, you do not have to fix everything. You do not have to explain the past. Sometimes the bravest thing is simply opening the door and saying, "I am here now." Stories like this are not meant to end when the screen goes dark. They are meant to follow you into the quiet parts of your life where real decisions are made without an audience. Some families are born, some are chosen. Some doors change lives when they open. Others change lives because they stay open. If this story found you tonight, maybe it is not an accident. Maybe it is just your reminder that it is not too late to open something or to keep it open a little longer.